This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. If you are joining us on YouTube, you should know that this program is also available on your favorite podcast platform. This talk is with Ian Smith, Professor of English and Sell Chair in the Humanities, Lafayette College. Ian is currently serving as president of the Shakespeare Association of America. We will begin by taking a look at his recent book, Black Shakespeare, Reading and Misreading Race. We will also talk about his past and current research in Shakespeare and in other areas. This series is funded with support from the Aoyama Gakuin University Institute of the Humanities, and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Ian, thank you so much. It is so happy to finally have a chance to meet you. I know you by reputation, but welcome to our little series here.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, and well, the pleasure is ours, and you have a very recent book, 2022 publication, and the title is Black Shakespeare, Reading and Misreading Race. And in this, you begin by talking about the idea of developing racial literacy across the board in reading, and state that this has been the invisibility of Blackness in Shakespeare has been talked about a good bit, but you wanted to shift the focus of the conversation to to quote you, the cause and purpose, and then locate the resistance to race in the historical conditions that shape readers, inform their epistemologies, and influence their reading practices. And to do this, that requires that you build onto a history, well, a couple of histories, one being the history of reader response criticism and the hermeneutics that in a certain way, well, democratized reading, gave us a sense of that we bring our own individual experience into the reading, and that that text does something back to us. There's an exchange between us. However, there's been the omission of Blackness in this movement of reader response that you locate at some point in primarily and kind of specifically American history, and efforts throughout American history that we know too well to keep Black people illiterate, away from away from the resources where they might have a voice in this. This is bled into Shakespeare studies, of course, and the sum result is there's a kind of whiteout of what happens in Shakespeare that is thematically racial, and this you call systemic whiteness. And so there's an analysis of Shakespearean text in your book, and things that we may not see that have been invisible, but in doing so, you have to analyze whiteness along the way. And I would like to hand this over to you and have you tell us something about how you approach this book, and in a kind of summary, your overall argument and what you hope this book achieves in our field.
Well, thank you. Well, you summarized a good deal of it very nicely there for me, so thank you. So I'll just pick up on some of the elements that you have raised and speak about some of those. I think you're very right to highlight the first thing that you did, which is the book, in summary, is about, on the one hand, making a claim for and reminding us of what I would call sort of the racial evidence in the plays by Shakespeare, and on the other hand, the ignorance or unwillingness or refusal to reckon with that evidence. That is the tension that I seek to sort of capture in the title, Black Shakespeare, Reading and Misreading Race. That's it, simply put. Now, you called attention to the fact that what I'm addressing in a sort of broad disciplinary and cultural sense has to do with what I call racial denial. That there's been for a very long time in our broad culture resistance to seeing race, factoring race into all areas of our sort of critical and political lives in positive ways. And as a result of that, there is what, and I cite him in the text because I love his metaphor. James Baldwin speaks about looking away. He says, in American culture, race is such a critical part of who we are, and yet we insist on looking away. And so there's a sort of broad cultural dimension of that denial or looking away. But since reading and writing and interpreting are part of our cultural activities too, I wanted to bring this attention to this denial and resistance and looking away from race in the work of scholarship, criticism, reading, and in particular reading Shakespeare as well. So that's a sort of connection to Shakespeare, yes, but to the broader cultural activities in the United States in particular. And so I wanted to address that. Now, in this text, critics have been saying for the last 30 years, there is race in Shakespeare. In other words, they've called attention to the racial evidence in Shakespeare. And they've also called attention to the denial. Mm-hmm. What I have done in this book, or what I'm attempting to do in this book, is to do what the section you quoted. That is to say, to look now, not just to repeat the claim there is racial denial, but to go a little further and ask, what are the causes of that denial? Mm-hmm. And then to also address what are the effects of that denial. That's what's different about this book, in addition to the earlier point, which is to also set this denial in a larger cultural frame as well. So those are the things I think that are important to what I'm trying to do in this text.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was fascinated with the way that you fluidly went from critical theoretical positions and then would move straight into recent news, of course, the problem, the continuing problem with, I think, ultimately an invisibility or a turning away, as you say. And of course, when Obama was president, there was a lot of turning away. It's like, okay, it's over. And I think anybody, who could look around and see anything knew that it wasn't over at all. And we saw how unover, it's not a word, but how unover it was. Yes. And so even though we're talking about Shakespeare as academics, as literary scholars, the world around us is all part of this and surrounds us and sometimes blinds us in the predominantly white Shakespeare industry. I've seen it over and over again. And I have a couple of examples of my own, but I'll hand it back to you because you have many examples in your book.
I'd love to hear your examples too. But as I was speaking just now, and when I was writing the book was published in late 22, in the fall of 22, and so these things take a while for it to get published. Mm-hmm. What is happening now in the United States with banned books and with various state legislatures and governors, et cetera, trying to somehow speak about Black history and the education that is part of American history writ large that attaches to African Americans in this country, that it has, of little educational value, I think is the expression that was used. We're right there again. So the denial now is, and this leads to the point I was making in the text, even though I wasn't addressing these recent developments while I was writing the book, that is to say, it's institutional. Here we have state legislatures and governors who are using the power of office of those powerful institutions that the country has granted them, and they're saying, we can't do this. Mm-hmm. And so this brings us to the issue of what I call systemic whiteness. Systemic whiteness is indeed the role that whiteness plays in the formation and operation of our social and cultural institutions. And so we're living it right now. Right? So in an odd way, and in a sad way, really, what I was trying to say in this book is, as you point out, it's over, it's ongoing, right? So here we are.
Here we
And
are.
so systemic whiteness is as a result of, and I'm using a word from a couple of critics who talk about it, Omi and Wyanand talk about racial formation as a sort of socio-historical process, right? And I'm adapting that in the sense that I'm suggesting that systemic whiteness is a socio-historical process. Because if you look starting, let's say, in 1790, where the Congress, once again, right, an institution, very powerful institution, says citizenship is only for white persons who are free. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have one of the most powerful institutions in the country that's defining what it is to be American as white. Mm-hmm. And then you can just follow the list after that, right, of various institutions in which that idea of white preference, as some people might call it, or a white bias, as others might describe it, mm-hmm. that is built into the system from the beginning. Mm-hmm. We think of the immigration debates in the 19th century. Those were all about defining a white polity that might come into the country mm-hmm. and exist, and excluding others, all the way through to 1924, when, in fact, the Johnson-Reed Act of 24 was grounded in sort of eugenics theory. I mean, that's how far we went down that hole mm-hmm. At that time. And let's not forget that some of those theories from 1924 were borrowed by the Germans in the 30s in their eugenics projects as well. Yeah. That's how troubling it has been.
Yeah. Yeah. For my students, I wanted to make sure that they know that eugenic theory is basically a theory of racial superiority based on pseudoscientific evidence of greater intelligence as depending on the pigment of your skin. Yeah. Is utterly absurd, but it's stuck.
It's stuck. And so here we are again now then with other versions of flexing those muscles to say, we don't want any of that sort of history. We should only want this. Mm-hmm. So the book is about, again, this tension between this straddling this sort of larger sort of cultural issues. And then within Shakespeare studies, a similar kind of refusal and denial on a smaller scale, but nonetheless, what I'm suggesting, an equally troubling scale that we should be careful about, that is, having a lot of care about and working towards undoing that kind of thing. So that's what systemic whiteness is, that it's there in the culture, it's in all the systems, whether it's the legal system, whether it's the educational system, whether it's a healthcare system, right? It's in all the systems, all the institutions, and then it's also in the Shakespeare system, or what we call the Shakespeare industry as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think that there are so many things we could talk about here. To go to the reactionary business and state legislatures and the constant pounding in conservative media of, CRT became an acronym, and it just represented a way for these leftists to come in and make our children feel bad about themselves because they're white. And I have, in all of my reading, James Baldwin throughout anyone, W.E.B. Du Bois, there's no kind of attack there. What there is listen, take a look at this, see it for what it is, right? That's all we're asking. And of course, while we're doing this, don't stop us and shoot us, like we could start there, yes. And that would be a good start, and let's move on out. And so that's what I got from your book. An analysis of this isn't an assault on white people. It's not there to make them feel guilty and bad, and then the next step is apologetic, which I'm sure is completely irritating for people who are doing this sort of thing. And just take a look, just stop and look.
That's it. And I appreciate your saying, because that's what it is. Because in fact, what I do call as the sort of the effect of systemic whiteness is then what I call sort of the white epistemology. That's the effect. And that white epistemology, in other words, that way of thinking. And I really want to underscore this, which is to your point. White epistemology is not about white persons. If there is a culture in which there's a built-in white bias that indeed began around white persons having certain privileges, etc., the effect is not about white persons. It's the effect on everyone in that culture. So a white epistemology is how it affects us all, and how we all are in danger of being limited in our reading of Shakespeare that produce what I call misreadings of Shakespeare, because we inhabit this space of white epistemology, because we live in a culture in which this white epistemology has been the dominant way of thinking, right? And what we're just referencing with regard to various states trying to impose certain laws, that is the imposition of a certain kind of white epistemology through law, right? But it affects everybody. So it's not about white people or white persons. It's about how the way of thinking that is being imposed, and that has historically become part of the condition of our thinking lives, how that limits how we see, particularly when, as I said, and we must remember this, in Shakespeare's work and Shakespeare's time, he was very much aware, and his other playwrights, and they were very much aware of people of color, in particular in this book, coming into England, doing various kinds of work as mariners, as porters, as weavers, as musicians, and of course, as servants, etc., and by extension in various parts of the world, as enslaved persons as well, right? So there is a knowledge and awareness of this. It's not as if we can just eradicate that in some way, or worse, do the kind of, oh, well, there's the one play, there's the Othello play, and we can talk about blackness there. And if we can't, other than that, let's not do that. So, it becomes a sort of weird slice, we're taking bits of the canon out and then saying, well, we can do it over here. Maybe. I say maybe because, there's this, I remember, and I've written about this, and I remember being in a seminar once, and where the seminar was about Othello, and somebody sitting right across from me said, Othello is not about race. And so if there's repeatedly said this, and so even there, one can't even allow that. So earlier you talked about the ways that in which in this country, reading has been a function of, again, an imposed illiteracy on Black persons, which is true, right? The 1740 Negro Act, in fact, imposed regulations around educating Black people, so that Black people were by law meant to be illiterate. So this is not about Black people being naturally, as you said, in terms of naturally sort of not being able to do certain kinds of intellectual work. No, this was made so by law. But I come back to the point that you referenced earlier, which is about the illiteracy, because what I'm saying in this text is, even though historically this country for a significant period of time and with significant effects imposed illiteracy on a group of people singled out deliberately, Margaret, in this book is the result of that is we've created a kind of illiteracy for the country as a whole, in terms of not being able to then read race or to understand what it is to have this part of American history as a significant part of who we are. We've ironically created a kind of illiteracy for ourselves.
Yeah, in restricting a group and selecting a group and saying, you cannot be literate, you abolish that hermeneutic, and in doing so, you abolish part of your literacy if you're in the dominant group, right?
Yes.
Everybody loses,
Everybody.
and I wanted to talk about just a little bit about Othello. This is E.A.J. Honigman's Othello, Arden edition, and some years ago, and it's a exquisitely well edited book. But right here at the beginning, he goes into race, and he presents this picture of a Moor that visited. Right. And he goes, well, this just settles the question, right? This is the extent of, the dispute over whether Othello is a black or an olive-colored North African Moor, right? Now, this portrait to ambassador to Queen Elizabeth settles the question. That's all right. But, it's part of a reparative we have Ayanna Thompson's new introduction, which handles this matter, of course, much and a much better and a much more accurate way. And I just don't know. I mean, when I read this to begin with, I'm going, listen, the line "I am black" is said by Othello. Right? How could you not see that? Right? And
that's an editor.
Yes.
As an editor who spent so much time
yes.
wrangling with the words of the text.
Every word, and there it is, and several other examples. This very clear.
That kind of thing. What does that mean, right?
It's just the whole thing is built around that. That's the dramatic tension, of the father, right? Who is somebody's I don't know, a movie star or a great NBA player or something. Yeah, come over to the house. We'd love to. Yeah. And then the guy says, and also, I'd like to marry your daughter. That's where we get into some trouble, right? And I think that's right now, in a large sector of society.
It is very current. And that's why I think the play continues to resonate. Because what you just did was to update it in terms that we can, not all of us, are sons and daughters of a senator, but in the age of celebrity, we often see people who are basketball stars or whatever. And we also know, as you say, in a lot of places in our culture, where whether you are famous or not, those rules are still in place. Yes, you can invite X over, but once it crosses the line about becoming too close, and people get worried for hosts of reasons. And so you can see that kind of thing around you. And so in some way it says, okay, it invites you in to explore more, to see how this has something to say about life then, and how, as a kind of ongoing document that can speak to us, how it can speak to us now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think there is a first response, a defensive response in what we're generally calling the white world. That's a very large and diverse world, just as the black world is too. But if we're sticking to the states, some guy from Eastern Kentucky may be walking out of his trailer going, I'm going to take some of this white privilege now and see if I can pay my power bill with it, right? And be a little, have some contempt for that whole idea. And it doesn't feel very privileged. But when you start thinking about it, and I started thinking about it recently, and thinking, at what points, when you're pulled over, and I have been pulled over in my past when I was a young man, sometimes broke a traffic law, and there were a couple of times I can think about where I'm going, it's not bad to be white here. Right, because this was in the American South, and you look back and you go, this thing could go completely wrong if I'm not and it helps to have a nice haircut and whatever, not look like you might be a motorcycle, a biker or something, a white biker, or what, and be polite, all of that stuff. But it's there, yeah. And And I never drove the streets with the fear of, when I saw the police car behind me, that, the only fear I would have is, oh my goodness, this might cost some money if I'm breaking a law or something. But I never had the fear of someone pulling a weapon, right? Uh, and that I think it just feeds straight into Othello, because there is always the potential for violence there. At the very beginning, Brabantio sends out his men, and that could easily turn into just a street killing right there on the spot. And also backed by the example of Othello's dignity, right, in the face of all this. Another example, it dignifies his race, and that's something that can be drawn here from it too. But you have many, many more examples from Shakespeare, and also how you built upon the way in which this was shaped and formed that so much of the Shakespearean world never saw.
But one of the things I'd like to, since you're speaking about Othello, and I think it's an important opening, and I hope I think about this when I think about this play. So I hope I'm not just repeating for the sake of repeating, but I think it's important. So very quickly, at the beginning of this play, you're right that Othello is in a place where there is potential lot of danger. Remember, for example, in The Merchant of Venice, when Morocco, that black character, comes in, he says, don't hate me because I am black. Mislike me not for my complexion. So he knows that in the same city called Venice, in Shakespeare's Venice, there is this racial tension. He knows. So as I like to say, word has got out beyond Venice, right? Yeah. Into the wider world, that's what's going on. So Othello is in, as you say, some degree of danger that he's not, I think, fully aware of at the beginning, how deep that danger might be.
Yeah.
He's a warrior. He knows there's danger on the military field.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if he fully comprehends how deep the cultural dangers are that beset him. In any event, he comes in and in Act 1, Scene 2. But in Act 1, Scene 1, Shakespeare has him mentioned, but he is nameless. It's just the Moor. And I think this is so important because insofar as there's a kind of invisibility that you talked about, there is a kind of invisibility, yes, but that invisibility is supplanted really by a kind of, how should I call it? A kind of mental caricature visibility, which people have been taught to have. So I may not know this person, but I know of such a person. I know what such a person is like. So repeatedly, the word Moor is used over and over again.
Desdemona refers to him as his.
Everybody in Act 1, Scene 1 says more, 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 right? But before he comes on stage, I'm saying, before he appears.
Yeah.
And the function of that is, it becomes this kind of almost echo in Act 1, Scene 1. More, more, more. And although we don't see him, the audience, I think, in Shakespeare's time, the function of that is for them to say, oh, we know what such a person looks like, literally, but also in terms of character. We know who a Moor is.
Yeah.
And then when we see him in Act 1, Scene 2, Shakespeare does this rather dramatic thing that he frames him, as you say, when they come for him now, right? They come to take him to the Senate. Shakespeare gives us this Garden of Gethsemane scene where it's him, Othello, saying, put up your bright swords, whatever, which is sort of replaying the words of Jesus in the John story, right? Yeah. And they come with torches, etc. And it's at night. And for an audience who is biblically literate at the time, they get it.
Oh yeah.
But the shock of a Moor who's supposed to be Muslim, who's supposed to be non-English, who's supposed to be then this host of things that they have learned if not in books, but they've learned in the theater for the last 15 or so years, going back from the Battle of Alcazar all the way through Titus Andronicus, through, right? They've learned from a stage education what Moors are. And here we have suddenly this Moor who is cast in the role of Jesus. Shakespeare deliberately creates that cognitive sort of dissonant shock. Mm-hmm. And the function of that is to, A, challenge people's racial perceptions that they have before they even meet you, and B, to then force us to ask, well, how reliable are those preconceptions anyway?
Yeah.
And then C, it makes them understand what race is as opposed to just Blackness. That race is the ideas we have about a person and how we can manipulate those ideas and put them to a certain kind of social purpose, often negative purpose sometimes, right? But not always. And in this case, the final thing that Shakespeare does is he says, now you do realize that you're thinking about him in this way because you, the audience, are constructed as white. Mm-hmm. And so that you have a sort of white racial construction, which is not just about your body also, but about the idea of whiteness and what it means, mm-hmm. and what value it has, because that's really what's at work. Whiteness is not about just whiteness. Whiteness is about the perceived value that whiteness has in a culture. And why it must be protected, why it must be sought after, why it must be acquired, why it must be held on to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that brings us to your connection between, you go back to William Hazlitt's essay, We Are Hamlet, but then the title of your chapter 5, We Are Othello. Now, yes. there's a leap there, but I think that's where you're going right now, that this identification, that these trials that Othello goes through, you have to go through too. You know, if you give it a good reading and you try to go through it on his side, right, and see from his eyes, or the way that actor is portrayed, then you have to be able to relate on some level how hard it would be to mediate the culture that he is trying to mediate.
Yes. And what I do is to get to that point is I go to the very end of the play when he's dying in his final speech, and he says, soft your word or two before I go. And then he begins to say, he says, to tell my story. And so what we understand in that moment is he's not just speaking to the people around him, which that's important, but the people around him are all Venetians. These are all people who he says, you Venetian Christians, you will tell the story. And that will be the verdict on who I am. And then by extension, he's saying, us, critics in 2023, scholars, how are you going to tell that story? Mm-hmm. And how are you going to cast that verdict as well, right? And so Shakespeare does this wonderfully brilliant move by creating an audience once again. It's all about how he is constructing this audience and asking the audience to wrestle with these questions in a way that puts us in an interrogative mood, but also puts us on the spot to say, now, who are you going to be? Are you going to simply trot out the same old Moor thing at the beginning after all you have been through watching and experiencing this play? Or do you have a much more nuanced and modulated version of what it is to be a Black man like Othello in a white space like Venice, at our behest in Cyprus, etc., right? It's a much more complicated question. And so the title that you reference, We Are Othello, is indeed a sort of take on the Hazlitt question. It is we who are Hamlet. And I'm saying, when we think of it as we who are Hamlet, there's a way in which that has become a significant thematic of Hamlet criticism. That is the identification of critics with Hamlet over and over and over again, right? But that identification, I would argue, is also, given the history of our scholarship and criticism is a white identification. So Hamlet can only be white. Where I argue in that play that it's not as simple as that either. It's much more complicated than that. But because we are Hamlet, it has obliterated to some degree the possibility of even asking other kinds of questions before we even get to them. In We Are Othello, I'm saying maybe we want to shift that paradigm and begin to ask a much more complex kind of question is, can we be those people whom Shakespeare asks us to be to tell Othello's story? And in so doing, we stand in his place. We stand in his shoes. We look from that perspective and we try to see the world and tell that story with that much more complex understanding.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you also draw connections between Hamlet and Othello, going back to the term the Moor, and you do a kind of exegetical study of the use of the term Moor in Hamlet as being, of course, the Moorish, the lower area, the place you don't want to be compared with the mountain and so forth. But you point to the capitalization of the M in Moor, right?
And we have it's not as if critics call attention to that before. I mean, I've seen critics who have said, the more, but again, just the almost refusal to take that seriously in a sustained way. Mm-hmm. And in that part of the book, I thought, well, I would like to take a look at that in a much more serious and sustained way and see what happens. And and it's a long and sort of complicated chapter, but I would do just this, just as a kind of another way of approaching this. Go back to the beginning of this play. And so we've all been taught to read Hamlet in various versions, but not in a racial way at all. Mm-hmm. But if you go back to when Hamlet appears on stage, and he's standing there for a long time, very quiet, not saying anything, and then his first, words, exchanges, and Claudius says to him, something about why are you, the clouds, you're so much of the cloud, meaning why are you so upset? Why are you so melancholy? Why are you so under the weather, as we would say today? And he says, no, my lord, I'm too much in the sun. And I've never seen an editor or anybody else sort of just say, well, hold on. What does that mean? And they go on to talk about SUN really being a pun for SON, and so on and so forth, because the father-son thing in the play. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying, well, what if we were to also use the kind of tools that we have been encouraged and taught to use in reading Shakespeare, which is to, trace the meaning of words and trace the histories of words and to think of the sort of simultaneity of multiple meanings in the way the sort of poetic text works. We've been all taught to do that any given word like SUN could mean SON, right? It can mean multiple things at once. Mm-hmm. And I say, well, why did we just stop at SUN, SON? Why not think of the story that tells us how indeed white people became Black people in the history of the world, right? Yes. And there's a famous story in Ovid that tells us how that happens. And the short version is that they get too close to the chariot, which is the sun, gets out of control, comes too close to the earth, singes the people who presumably were white before, and they're burned Black. And the text then says, and that land was called Ethiopia. Well, of course, we know the word Ethiopia. We know that, right? From, I think, the Greek means people of a sunburned face. Yeah. That's what the word means. Yeah. So when Hamlet says I'm too much in the sun, meaning too much sun, meaning I'm sunburnt, mm-hmm. Why have we not bothered to take that as an option? Mm-hmm. In all the ways we've been taught to read Shakespeare's language, that I think is consistent with what we've been taught to read. Why not do that? And if we ask that question, then might we not begin to say, how is Shakespeare setting us up from the beginning to see and ask racial questions in this play? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that opens up so much in my mind, because there is the assumption that the original state was whiteness turned into blackness, when we know now that that was just not the case by any kind of scientific evidence. And also, uh, there there is this connection with his black clothing, that he is in mourning, and he is going to, well, this is another element of your book, the violent black man. He's going into that mode, perhaps. You could go in a number of directions here that I think would be more than just idle speculation.
Well, that's what I tried to do in the chapter as that you're alluding to, right? And
Yeah.
but I think what I'm in this conversation, I'm saying let's just think of if we read and make visible the racial evidence at the beginning, it might allow us to think, okay, we can see, because the frame of the play might be different for us. You begin to see that there are these things up front. But if they're just not there, we just carry along and we do the Hazlitt thing. It is we who are Hamlet, right? But if we see that differently, are we going to be so blithely, happily running along saying, we are Hamlet? I don't think so, because it becomes much more complicated. And so to your point, yes, he's in black clothing at the beginning. So that's right at the beginning, right after he says, I'm to mention the son. Then, the mother says to him, why are you still in mourning clothes, etc. And they go on about the clothing. And it's like, well, why are we going on about this clothing for such a little while here? And then you say, okay, is it possible that it's just black clothes for mourning? Maybe. But another way to ask that question is, and I think the audience in Shakespeare's time, again, they have the kind of literacy to read this. We have lost some of that because because we haven't had the sort of continuity of the sort of staging practices, so we're unaware. But if there's anything that any high schooler has been taught about Hamlet, is about the play within the play, or some version of that, right? And so the idea then that this is a play that is what we call meta-performative, or meta-theatrical. It's a play about theater. It's a bit about Hamlet talking about and acting out being an actor and being in a play and being what we call a director these days of a play. It's all about theater and performance. Well, if that's true, and that's very true, because the middle of the play is all about that, really, that huge chunk. And you say, well, why is this whole middle of this play about all this theater stuff? Then if we didn't get it at the beginning, then we can say, oh my goodness, in Shakespeare's time, actors who were supposed to impersonate Black people did so using Black clothing. So the emphasis on the Black clothing at the beginning was not just about mourning, but it was about what I call mooring, M-O-O-R-I-N-G.
Okay, yeah. I remember that now, yes.
Yeah. So it is and again, I really am asking us as teachers and as editors and, and theater practitioners, but certainly as a teacher myself, to just take the time to just look at the evidence and just offer the opportunity for students to say, what if?
Yeah.
Because given the framework, it makes perfect sense that the Black clothing can certainly be read in that way, once we understand that tradition. Now, I understand that that may not be something that we do know, so I get that. But once we do know that it's there, then suddenly that shifts the paradigm for us, I believe. And then, of course, it goes on to a whole host of other things there as well.
Yeah, well, some of this, you set up such a foundational kind of principle, a foundational theory in the early portions of the book, and you looked specifically at Hamlet and Othello. But in my mind, I kept thinking this also, it's probably in your future, you may be doing it already. This scales to, well, I think most immediately maybe to Cleopatra. And I spoke with David Sterling Brown about a year ago about this. He's done some work on this, the white hand and that sort of thing. But this is scalable, and it's, of course, to err into more, but you're opening up possibilities in Hamlet that are not immediately obvious. Actually, I don't think anybody has been given so much white out as it's Cleopatra. You know, that it just this is an Egyptian. You start there, and there's references to her tawny skin or whatnot in the play, and yet, you know.
No, listen, I hear you, and I completely agree. The reason that I went for a play like Hamlet is because it is, at least in the United States, it's one of those 4 or 5 plays that are routinely taught in high school. So you have then a kind of perpetuation of a particular kind of white epistemology, let's call it that for our argument, that is just been sort of played and replayed and replayed. Yeah. Whereas Antony and Cleopatra is not the kind of play that's taught in high school, say, for example. That's, and maybe for graduate school. I'm not even quite sure if it's that a popular text for college, really, right? So I went for Hamlet because everybody thinks they know Hamlet. It is, in some sense, the most famous of the plays, one could argue, right? And so I wanted to, as you say, to test my argument, to choose some of the most famous plays, to say, okay, these have been read by tons of people, probably continue to be read by tons of people, and I want them to test my argument about racial literacy, about its absence, and to see what happens when you do bring a racial literacy to plays like this, how they dramatically change. Plays that we think we all know. And so you have the effect that you're describing, that, recently somebody wrote to me and said, I never thought that anybody could have anything new to say about the Merchant of Venice until I read, and that was, of course, quite complimentary and so on. But I really wanted to choose plays that were well known. I wasn't going to write on something like Cymbeline, which one could have, right? And fine, people have done good work in Cymbeline, but I wanted to choose plays that were immediately recognizable, that were often performed, and that students, even at the high school level, would recognize and be able to say, okay, I know that play, I've been taught that play, and it means that it could give high school teachers, college teachers, graduate school professors, everybody has a chance to go back and think about and test the work I'm doing to see if it makes sense to them.
Yeah, those are the core elements, and you reach. As Cymbeline, if you haven't read it recently, it's going to be hard. But most of us have fairly clear memory, understanding. So I teach it every year. I teach Hamlet and Othello almost every year. And after a certain number of years, it really does stick. So, but not Cymbeline. And well, I wanted to go to another thing too. There are bits of this, more than bits in your book, but the usage of the hierarchy of fairness, of whiteness in beauty, right? I think Benedict says of Hero and Much Ado, she's too brown for a fair praise, right? Therefore, not as beautiful as Beatrice. And these, for me, over time, has become more and more cringeworthy when I teach these plays, and it's all over the place. And even going into the high idea of darkness, or the equivalency with darkness and evil and so forth, and I just don't know what to do about that. I really don't know what in teaching, other than to point it out.
Yes, and so you're asking me to what would I do with it?
Yeah, I would like to know. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I have an answer, but I'll just say a few things that are on my mind. So you're right. Just to add to your example, so you mentioned Much Ado, and also you say it's all over the place, as in Love, Labour's Lost, for example. There's that whole section where they tease Barone about Rosalind, about her being, dark and the black brows and the black and so on and so forth. And
Yeah.
she, her looking like, as black as like the black polish on the shoe, that kind of thing, right? But you're absolutely right. It's in several places. I would say on the one hand, and I like to sort of say this to my students, so because I think it has a lot of significance. It's a small point, but I think a small point with a lot of weight. That is, when we think of the word fairness, and the idea of fairness, of course, has been, as a kind of racial term, has been called out to us since the 1990s, right? We remember that Kim Hall's work did that beautifully. What I like to do in teaching is to say to students now, okay, so we know that fair can certainly mean, and we can do the exercise, go to the OED, look it up or whatever, right? And certainly we can see as certain kinds of points. That fair can mean beauty, obviously, and that's the one that students would know. But fair can also mean, and certainly I think it resonates today, it could mean just, right, or equitable, to be fair. But fair can also mean white as well. So just to take those three. And what I like to point out to them is that those three, once again, in the way in which early modern English works, again, what we've been always taught, right, about how the language arts and rhetoric works, is they're not separate. They coexist. They're interlaced. One is layered on top of the other. So to be beautiful is to be white. To be white is to be just and righteous. And that all those things are equal. Imagine the power of that sort of a concoction of beauty, fairness, and righteousness. And right, to think that, and just think about how that bundle of three has carried forward in our culture, even today, that those things still constitute part of the core of how we think about whiteness. Well, on the other hand, then what does it say about blackness, right? Blackness is not those things, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a way there, I think, to engage students in a conversation about not just the words, but now the cultural impact, certainly historically as well. So that's one thing I like to do with that. To your point about what does it mean then to the way in which they play around with, the dark beauty, who's somehow not as beautiful as the blonde, fair beauty. Historically, one could talk about the way in which the sort of the blonde beauty with the blue eyes and the fair skin and so on, that has been the sort of traditional, sort of idealized version. And what we find in Shakespeare is that he's challenging, I would say, that version. When he puts in someone like a Rosaline or another character who does not fall into that traditional category, but who early on in the play, in Love's Labour's Lost, we hear, she's referred to as their white hand, right? Just as Jessica, for example, in Merchant, we hear about her white hand, almost more than white hand, right? But of course, the problem, quote unquote, problem for that society is that she's Jewish. So her whiteness is always qualified anyway, even though she is more than white.
Okay.
There's a way in which Shakespeare is asking us to think that in his culture, they do a kind of, use the word hierarchy. I'm not sure if this is what you're referring to, but not just a hierarchy of black and white, but a hierarchy of white and white, that certain forms of whiteness are not as valuable as other forms of whiteness. It becomes far more, I think, obvious for us in a play like Merchant, where Jessica's whiteness is qualified because she's Jewish, so she's not, somehow her whiteness doesn't work quite as well. It seems less so in a play like in Much Ado or in Love's Labour's Lost or in a number of other plays. But I would argue that the idea that Shakespeare is still now saying, as he did in Othello, there is a whiteness that the guys who like these women point out, and they find her highly desirable. What does it say about our culture that all these other people are making fun of her whiteness because she has dark hair and dark eyebrows? And so what does that mean? And how does that say something about the way that we continue to, of course, here you wouldn't use the word racialize, but we continue to even racialize certain forms of whiteness.
Right.
And I think he is allowed room for to see not just a kind of repetition of the pattern, but room for critique of the pattern. Because there's one person over here saying, well, I love her, and the other making fun of him for loving her. And there's room there to say, well, what's really going on here? And does it really make sense to create these sort of strategies, these various sort of categories of whiteness? And so it might seem benign. I don't think it is. It's certainly not benign when we get into a play like Merchant, as I said before. But I think that Shakespeare is helping us see that something like that, of course, is clearly, it has the remnants of class as well, because those who work outdoors are then often seen as darker versions of white, and we see that as well. So there's a class component to it.
Yeah.
But he's suggesting how even among the upper echelons, if you happen not to be of a certain kind of ideal of beauty, even there, a kind of work of discrimination and bias functions and operates, which means that there's something dysfunctional about that system to begin.
Yeah. It surely does. Of course, the term redneck is circling. I grew up in the American South, and there were I think those distinctions had to do with people who did farm labor as opposed to the more moneyed class of people merchant class, the landowners who would take care to wear hats, and of course the ladies who would have, and you see this in Japan now, you see on a sunny day a young woman walking with a parasol. Because that's the thing here too. Not with my wife; she gets out in the sun as quickly as she can. But she's commented on this. That people will comment on how she's a browner than.
There you go. Yes.
Yeah. Even so, there we have it right now today in Japan. Somebody is that standard for a lot of people. I don't think it's ubiquitous, but it's here certainly.
It's in the Island Princess, that play. It's there too, when the lead character, is really careful about wanting to stay in the shade so that her skin continues to be as pale as possible, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have the same sort of those concerns about being in the shade and so on that are played out there too, as you were referring to in terms of use of the parasols, etc.
Yeah. Here it is, here and now. All right. Well, what I want to do is also, I don't want to let you leave before you connect. You made mention of your background as a rhetorician, and you're a scholar of rhetoric also. And in terms of Hamlet, the punning, I don't think Hamlet ever speaks without punning, and sometimes triple puns and so forth. But could you, for our viewers, talk a little bit about your background in rhetoric and what you've done in that area?
Yeah. Yes. Well, the work I've done, I wouldn't call myself a rhetorician because I think that
Yeah, that was, I'm sorry. I didn't,
no, no, no,
that came out
no.
of,
I'm not disagreeing with you so much as I'm just saying, I'm not sure that, other people who really seem to the rhetoricians would see me in that way.
oh, okay, okay.
I did some work in the field of rhetoric, but I wouldn't say I'm a rhetorician.
Yeah.
And so the work that I did had to do with trying to think about how rhetoric is a way for us to understand how the early modern period thought about race at that time. Um, the reason I did that, even before I focused on talking about something like skin color, is because I think that we have been so focused on skin coloring in the sort of, more recent time, certainly since the 18th century on. But I want to sort of step back from that and try, at least for myself, to get a clearer view of, well, how did they understand that? In addition to just sort of going for the more sort of highly visible skin and blackness and so on. And so what I did was what I came to understand as I was doing my research is that the word barbarism kept coming up again and again. And I wondered, well, what does that mean? And the short version is this, that in the early modern period, they adopted a structure and a paradigm that was as old as the Greeks, in which the Greeks thought of their language as the superior, beautiful language, and that anybody who was non-Greek did not have that euphonic, beautiful sounding language. And of course, the Romans sort of inherited that structure as well. And so that was the sort of the contrast then between eloquent speech on the one hand, which is what the Greeks and Romans thought they had, and that anybody who was non-Greek and non-Roman was seen as barbarous. So the word barbarous had this racializing function, but it was about language or how you speak. And if you think about it today, we still racialize the way people speak. I was born in the Caribbean, and there are lots of times, I think, when people sort of, do this kind of weird sort of looking thing because they immediately sort of hear me speak and it's like, well, you're not quite American. What are you? Kind of, right? So that sort of figure out what that is, or I don't quite hear what you're saying is some version of that. And so for me, it was sort of very real because I understood that the ways in which language continues to racialize even today. So it wasn't hard for me to get it, so to speak. And so what I tried to do then is to see how that applied. Now, in Shakespeare's time, indeed, it was clear that the idea of barbarism was in fact something that was used to refer to Africans. Indeed, there's a particular moment where we can read about the idea that Northern Africa was called Barbary by Christian merchants because they'd done some trade there. And so the idea that the word barbarism, which comes from rhetoric, which is about a kind of linguistic error that you make that betrays or reveals your foreignness, your outsider status. So you're not Greek, you're not Roman, you are outside, right? And so Quintilian has a sort of wonderful moment where he talks about, language as something that you monitor, and that language is like an empire, and you have to sort of like constantly monitor the borders so you don't let barbarisms in. Clearly, he's playing on the idea of language and rhetoric, but also on the idea that literally you don't want to let Roman people into the empire unless they've been given permission, etc. So that gets translated into the modern period, except that they understood in Shakespeare's time that the etymology of barbarian was not the same as the barbarous. But despite that, they continued to now make a connection, even though etymologically it wasn't there. And I find that interesting. So, the idea that you forced a connection means that you want to make that not only the connection, it means that you want culturally to replicate the pattern of insider-outsider in modern terms, whereby the African/barbarian from Africa, from Barbary, becomes the modern version of the non-Greek or non-Roman. So that's the work I did there. And so it functions and comes out of this whole business of rhetoric. And we must also remember now why that was interesting to the English was that in the 16th century, England was just beginning to see themselves as trying to rehabilitate English itself. Because the truth is, other Europeans had long called English a barbarous tongue, right? So it now was a convenient moment for England to say, well, we are refashioning our language.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that we study, whether it's the Sidneys or Spencer or Shakespeare, they were part of this sort of rehabilitation of the English language.
Yeah.
But it was now convenient to find another barbarian, not us English now, because we are doing our English thing. And so the Africans became not just a linguistic idea, but sort of an embodiment of this otherness.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, sorry, I hope that wasn't too long.
You see that moving south down through the Italy, the notion that it's exotic, but these are, and then the further south you get, the worse it gets. And they were trying to take the vulgar language, the vernacular, and turn it into something that replicated classical form. And there was a strong desire to do that.
Yes.
And in doing so, you elevate yourself, but then you begin thinking of yourself as better than those other folks outside, right?
And you have to find somebody.
Yes.
And they can't say it's the Romans and Greeks now because they're modeling them. So you have to find somebody, right?
There should be somebody. It always seems to be.
Yes.
You did some work too on fairly recently, and I'm bringing it up here. I want to get the title right: "The Shadowed Livery and the Merchant of Venice." We've talked about the Merchant of Venice, but the black body, of course, you talked about blackface and cross dressing or cross racializing. Yeah, there's a lot out there now, but could you let our viewers know just kind of how you are positioned in that subset of critical race studies?
Yes. Well, and that's what I'm working on now, actually. I'm trying to go back to some of that work now and do something that I had thought about for really about the last 20 years. So
yes, that's what I'm referring to right here. Your most recent project, your current working project called Dressed in Black, Racial Cross-Dressing. I confused that with another one, yeah.
No, that's great. That's great. So a long time ago, I just asked this very simple question, which is, given the changes that were happening in the early modern world, and especially with international trade, and with England and Europeans in general meeting other non-European people through trade in particular, and commerce more broadly, I thought, well, why, with all these plays where when we begin to see foreigners, aliens, Black people in particular on the stage, what did they do? Because as far as we know, they didn't have Black actors in Shakespeare's time, just as we didn't have women on the stage in Shakespeare's time. So we said, what did they do? And that was a question of real curiosity. And then the project then for me began, as I said, way back then, to start thinking about, well, what does this mean? And is this a performance thing? And it to me became more than just a performance project, because I don't see myself once again as being a performance person. So once again, I'm stepping into areas that traditionally I wouldn't sort of claim for myself. But this one intrigued me because it really was a question. And And so I started doing some research, and the short version is this. We have talked about, certainly in the United States, certain kinds of blackface that goes back to the 19th century. And, blackface and blackface minstrelsy and so on and so forth. And then those critics who have done some work on this, certainly since I did some initial publishing years ago, have often gone on to talk about cosmetics and the use of cosmetics or face paint, which one could argue that's consistent with the sort of blackface in terms of methodologies, not necessarily ideology, but the blackface methodology of 19th century work. So painting the skin by use of all kinds of things. What fascinated me was I discovered through my research that before they were doing the kind of painting that most critics have gone on to talk about, somewhere in the 16th century, so certainly as far back as 1510, we find that they were using textiles to imitate black skin and not just paint. And that fascinated because I had no idea. And so that's why when we talked about Hamlet early on, I said the whole business of his black clothing. You see, it turns out that they would use black clothing or textiles to cover the extremities, the arms, the legs of an actor on stage to literally, pun intended, fabricate black skin. And they would also use a finer type of gauzy type of material to cover the face as well. And so the research I'm doing now will focus on the textile part of that history. Mm-hmm. Since so much attention has been given, I think, well, in other words, when I say so much, it's the one that I think, given our history in blackface, as I say, in the 19th century, we kind of think, oh, it's going to be painting something on your skin. And again, as you can tell at this point, I'm more interested in seeing, well, what else is there? That, in other words, not the what we know, because I'm more interested in what we don't know, right? Yeah. And for me, the what we don't know or don't know well is use of textile and cloth. And so the work I'm doing now is about that. And then the real question is, what are the implications for us in their use of cloth and textiles? And that's the project I'm working on now.
Excellent. I just can't wait because you had two things I'm interested in, of course, what you're working on in race, but when you go into these things like textiles during that time, it's just so interesting what you come up with. And so we'll look forward to that. I think that really from your personal experience that you were uniquely well qualified to analyze race relations in the States. You bring in a new perspective. And of course, all of the scholars who are working in race studies in Shakespeare, I've looked through, and people come from various backgrounds, and everybody has their position and has their contribution to make to this wider field. Well, Ian, I could talk. There's so much we could talk about. I mean, beyond Shakespeare, it's just so much. It's just such a joy to meet you. And I'm going to have to close. I would like you to stay a little bit after we finish recording so we can debrief just a bit. But once again, thank you so much for joining our little series here.
Thank you so much. And this really was a conversation. And I thank you for that, because you made it very easy and comfortable in that sense. So was very happy to be here. And hopefully, if I do get the racial cross-dressing work done, you'll have me back.
I will. We will be delighted to. And it's our pleasure now. And let's think about the future too.